Now, the final tool that I want to review for improving your fitness comes from the category of nutrition. I've done lots of episodes about nutrition already on this podcast. We've done episodes about intermittent fasting. I did a long interview episode with Dr. Lane Norton, where we discussed all the ins and outs of nutrition as it relates to fat loss, muscle gain, fitness in general, lifestyle in general. So check out that episode where you will learn his philosophy on nutrition, which frankly is the one that I largely subscribe to. It, of course, obeys the laws of thermodynamics, calories in, calories out, being fundamentally important, but also gets into all sorts of details about which sources of protein are most effective and bioavailable, how much protein you can incorporate into your muscles after training, etc. All of that is included in that episode. With that said, the series on exercise with Dr. Andy Galpin also included an episode on nutrition. And while having the discussion for that episode and then listening to that episode again, I realized that while certainly I've gotten a number of things right about my nutrition across the years, there are a few areas where I could probably do better without much effort in ways that could really enhance my fitness. And the thing that I'm referring to is that for me, my first meal of the day lands somewhere around 11 a.m., maybe 12 noon. Sometimes I'll eat an earlier breakfast, but most typically I hydrate and caffeinate and train in the morning, and then I eat sometime around 11 or 12. And then I eat my last meal of the day sometime around 8:30 or 9. And as some of you already know, I tend to organize my meals such that meals during the early part of the day tend to lean more toward protein and fibrous carbohydrates. So things like, meat and salad, or chicken and salad, fish and salad, and maybe a little bit of starch. And the meals that I eat later in the day tend to be more starch focused and more vegetable focused. So things like pasta, rice, etc. later in the day because it helps me sleep. And the architecture of all that is really about energy and focus. I find I can focus a bit better and I have more energy throughout the day when I have my first meal at around 11 or 12, and I keep the total amount of carbohydrates that I ingest during the day moderate, not low, but moderate. Now, there is an exception to that, which is if I do a high-intensity resistance training session early in the morning, say train legs or train torso or even small body parts early in the morning, then I make sure to incorporate more starchy carbohydrates and some fruit, some simple sugars as well, into the first meal of the day so that I can replenish the glycogen that I depleted during those high-intensity resistance training sessions. However, after talking to Dr. Andy Galpin, I realized that I really shouldn't worry about or be afraid of eating something before training if I'm really hungry in the morning. So what I'm referring to here are the times in which I wake up and I want to train, but I personally like to train fasted and caffeinated. Okay. Yes, I do recommend that people delay their caffeine intake 90 to 120 minutes after waking, if and only if you have trouble with an afternoon crash, real fatigue in the afternoon, then it makes sense to delay your caffeine 90 to 120 minutes after waking. However, the exception to that is that if I'm going to train early in the day, I do ingest water to hydrate as well as electrolytes and caffeine prior to training. And sometimes that means I'm drinking caffeine within 30 minutes or 60 minutes of waking. I've tried to be clear about this in previous episodes, but I think a number of people have come to think that I always delay my caffeine intake 90 to 120 minutes after waking, and that's simply not the case. If I'm going to train, in particular if I'm going to do high-intensity resistance training or a long run, I will ingest caffeine sooner than 90 to 120 minutes after waking. And in addition to that, yes, I tend to eat my first meal around 11 a.m., maybe 12 noon, but if I wake up and I'm very hungry, I will eat a small meal. That includes typically some protein and some fat, so some Brazil nuts, maybe a couple scoops of whey protein would be typical for me, or maybe even a little bit of oatmeal, some whey protein, not a lot of food in my gut. But after talking to Dr. Andy Galpin, what I learned was for some people, training fasted feels best. I would consider myself one of those people. You may be somebody in that category as well, or you might be somebody who really feels as if you run best, you resistance train best when you've eaten, say 90 minutes or a couple hours before you do that. There are basically no specific rules as it relates to whether or not you train fasted or train fed, except what you can handle in terms of gastric distress. So you'll want to make food choices according to that and try and avoid, of course, gastric distress. But basically the change that I've made is if I wake up and I'm hungry, I'll eat a small meal. Or if I want to work out in the afternoon or I have to work out in the afternoon and I have lunch at, say, 12 or 12:30 or 11 a.m., and the only opportunity that I have to train is 1 p.m. or even 12:30, I will go ahead and train. And that's a new thing for me. Typically, I try to keep my meals at least 3 to 4 hours prior to any training bout. And of course, if you're sleeping all night, you're not eating. And then if you wake up and you don't eat and you train in the morning, that's certainly longer than 3 or 4 hours, unless you're sleeping very, very little, frankly. So essentially what I'm saying is figure out what works best for you. Do you prefer to train fasted or fed? For some of you, you might prefer fasted before cardio and fed before resistance training. For some of you, it might be fasted is always best. Again, I put myself in that category. For some of you, it might be fed is always best. Again, this is highly individual. And that's another point that I'm trying to make here, which is Dr. Galpin really impressed upon me that there is no hard and fast rule about training fasted or fed. And this is the second point, that having some flexibility in whether or not you can train fasted or fed allows you to incorporate your fitness training sessions more readily into a shifting schedule. And that's a really overarching theme of everything we've been discussing today, which is, yes, it's wonderful and important to have a core fitness program, something that you're really striving to do each and every week. And for me, that's 3 sessions of cardio, 3 resistance training sessions, and a day where I'm doing thermal stress training, which is just fancy language for deliberate cold and deliberate heat exposure. However, real life happens. Travel, work, illness, family, all the sorts of things that can impinge on an exercise schedule and make it less likely that one would complete their workouts. So today we've been discussing tools to improve your fitness, which are brief, easy to incorporate, scientifically supported, and that are shown to improve the various sorts of exercise adaptations and recovery that will allow you to get the most progress from your schedule. So while the tools that we discussed today relate to breathing, they relate to nutrition, they relate to supplementation, they relate to specific set and rep patterns and cadences and rest periods, etc. All of those specific recommendations are within a larger container that I hope has become clear, which is the best tools to improve your fitness are the tools that, of course, are going to be effective in improving your cardiovascular and strength and hypertrophy training, etc., whatever it is that your goals are, but also tools that are going to make it easier and more likely that you are going to engage in your fitness program with enthusiasm, with effort, and with focus.